For those of you who don't know where Liberia is, I would say Liberia is on, if you look at the African map, it's in the Atlantic southern part of West Africa. It had boundaries on the west with Sierra Leone on the north, with Guinea on the east, southeast, with Ivory Coast. The population, one might say at the time, it was about 3.2, others would say 3.5 million. In terms of size, for Americans, we can say that it's comparable to the state of Tennessee. It's slightly larger than the state of Ohio. Liberia do have rich natural and mineral resources. We do have timber, we do have rubber, we do have iron ore, we do have gold, we do have diamond, and other kind of resources, bauxite. Liberia is a member of ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States. It's also a member of the Monrovia Union. In fact, it's the founding member. 2 countries formed the Monrovia Union in 1973, Sierra Leone and Liberia. And then in 1980, Guinea joined the Monrovia Union. And so Liberia is in a very unique situation. In fact, it's so unique that many of our neighboring African countries see us as the 51st states of the United States. Why? Because of this long, allied history that we do share with the United States historically, financially, for over 100 years. So you can see the uniqueness of Liberia. Where do one start to understand the history of Liberia? Well, Liberians are quick to say that their country is the oldest African republic and the only country within the continent that was not colonized during the colonial period. Rather, it was a country established for repatriated people of African descent that were returning from the United States, that we call settlers, that we call Americo-Liberians, that we also call Congo. You know, Ethiopia made the same claim that they were also not under colonial rule, but of course we do know that they were for some time under the Italian rule. So then the question becomes, what was in Liberia before the settlers got there? Before the arrival of the settlers in the 19th century, there were 16 ethnic groups that inhabited what became known as Liberia. There's not much time for me to go through all of these 16 ethnic groups, but it's important for us to know that they spoke a mosaic of languages and dialects. But although these people were mingling and making this movement to the area where they find themselves, they also lived in a very distinct geographical areas in the region where they find themselves. We do not know when these people came to this region. We as historians are still trying to revisit and reconstruct the earliest movement of these people into this area. But there's one thing that we do believe and that we do know, that these earliest people that were moving in this region that became known as Liberia were coming from the north as a part of the southward migration, especially when we saw the great Sudanic states of Mali and Songhai decline and collapsing. These people were making the movement to a better place, looking for land. So we can say that by the 15th and 16th century, we saw this movement. And where did they settle? They settled along the coastal areas. Why is the coastal area important? Well, the coastal area is important for socio-cultural interaction. These people mingled, interacted with one another. But not only that this coastal area was important for socio-cultural interaction, it was this area that these people converged for trade purposes. But it was also in this coastal area that European trade was intensive. And we had all kinds of slave posts being established in this area. But there's one more thing that is important. It was in this coastal area that the settlers first established a Liberian government as they pressed inland. So this coastal area becomes extremely important. So it's important for us to understand that prior to 1800, that there were ethnic groups that established themselves in this region that became known as Liberia. Then came the 1800s. We saw the settlement of the settlers. When did this begin? I will claim that the settlement establishment in Liberia began in 1821 with the protection of the American government and the private sponsorship of the American Colonization Society. These settlers followed American models and strategies as they established themselves along the coast. What are those strategies? Outright conquest. The purchase of land that were not subject for sale. The conversion of treaties of friendship into deeds of ownership. A settler elite monopolized power and resources. The majority of the indigenous peoples were controlled by force. But not only that they were controlled by force, their leaders, their chiefs, were co-opted into a system of indirect rule. That's why I make the claim that even though Liberia was not colonized like other African countries, but the historical and political conjecture that emerged from the settlement, particularly the relationship between the returnees and the indigenous peoples, produced a familiar colonial conditions. What were those conditions? Exploitation, inequality, monopolization of power and resources. These conditions, I will suggest, led to deep contradictions, conflicts, and suspicions between the indigenous peoples and the settlers. Thus, I will say that the nature of the settlement made the degeneration of the state into authoritarianism almost inevitable. How can I prove this? We have to look at the roots of authoritarianism in Liberia. What were the roots of authoritarianism? The roots of authoritarianism were planted by the American Colonization Society during the settlement in Liberia. For example, the organization introduced several repressive measures. What were those measures? The nuisance law, which made it illegal for any Liberian to organize or participate in demonstration against the colonial government. Second was the association law, which banned Liberians from becoming members of any organization that was not sanctioned by the colonial government. So here what we saw, those who violated this rule were subject to fines, were subject to flogging, they were subject to imprisonment, they were subject to having their property confiscated. So in the initial stage, what we saw, that there was a suppression of the indigenous peoples. But following this colonial rule, each settler independent state formalized aspects of this, what I call authoritarianism in Liberia. They denied citizenship to the indigenous peoples. They violated the human rights of the citizens by forcing them to work in government projects without compensation. They levied taxes against the indigenous people without allowing them representation. So that from the J.J. Roberts administration, following to the latter administration of the settlers that we saw, maintain a fine tune of this authoritarianism. Let me give you an example of this kind of authoritarianism by the settler government. Let's take the Barclay administration from 1904 to 1943. I will claim that the Barclay administration laid the basis for the institutionalization of authoritarianism in Liberia. How? Well, under Barclay, we first saw the frontier force. Under this arrangement, this military organization was responsible for policing the interior, but not only policing the interior to make sure that there is tax payment compliance, but not only to make sure that there was tax payment compliance, to make sure the chiefs are accountable to Barclay. Thus, what we saw under Barclay's regime, that the frontier force became the principal instrument of coercion used against the indigenous people as they were suppressed with regards to their rights. And then we saw the famous regime of William V.S. Talbot, which many people believe was the golden age of Liberia. I will submit that even though we saw foreign investments, it was an attempt to be able to bring the indigenous people and the settlers together economically and politically. I will suggest that during William V.S. Talbot regime, we saw an extension of authoritarianism. How? By developing a network, a security network, which engaged in spying, intimidating, and imprisoning indigenous peoples who were opposing the settler government. But it was under William Talbot that we saw that the True Whig Party became institutionalized as a single party. All of those workers for the government were forced to become members of the party. And their salaries, portions of their salaries were taken and given for the maintenance and the functioning of the party. But not only that, we also find out that governments use state resources to provide benefits and salaries for party officials. And then we saw the William R. Talbot regime. When Talbot came into power in 1971, he vacillated between liberalization and authoritarianism. But it became very clear on which side Talbot was, because we saw in April 12, 1979, when Liberians were out there demonstrating as a result of the exorbitant high price of rice, Liberia's staple food, President Talbot ordered armed troops to shoot and kill Liberians that were out there. And thus, later on, those who were part of that movement and that organization, like Moja and Pa, those leaders were all arrested. And even student government leaders were also arrested and thrown into jail, and some of them were not even given any kind of justice. So I will claim that given this repressive political climate, the proximate conditions for triggering violent regime change was ripened. And as a result of this, we saw the coup of 1980.